Hey, it's Chris Niccolls here from Bow River Troutfitters. Today I want to cover two topics. I want to give you a beginner's guide to the different styles of flies that we fish, but also talk about our favorite flies for the Bow River. And this will give you a great setup if you're looking to tackle the Bow River for the first time, or you're just really trying to learn it. These are the flies that are going to bring you success. All right, so let's start with our beginner's guide to the four main groups of flies that we like to use in fly fishing. We're really trying to mimic the life cycle of aquatic insects for the most part, because that's usually what trout are going to be eating. And the first thing I want to talk about is nymphs. Now, nymphs are a kind of subsurface fly. They usually have weight on them, either heavy beads or lead wraps, to really get them to sink fast. It's important to remember that trout do most of their feeding below the surface of the water, so nymphing is actually one of the most productive ways to catch fish. Now, how do you actually fish them? Well, they are meant to sink. You generally want to have nymphs very close to the bottom of the river, and it's very important that whether you're fishing them under a fixed indicator or if you're high sticking them with a tight line, that you get that depth right. You know, they might hang up a little bit. You don't want them too deep catching every rock and piece of wood, but you definitely don't want them too high either. And once you get them in the strike zone, nymphing can be very effective. So the second group of flies I want to talk about are your wet flies, your emergers, your soft hackles. You see, aquatic insects spend most of their time at the bottom of the river, but eventually they're going to want to swim up to the banks, or they're going to go up to the surface of the water and hatch until their final form. And when they do that, they can be a very easy meal. So we'll often target trout with these kind of subsurface nymphs, but not near the bottom of the water. Now, when we're fishing wet flies, we'll actually use a bigger variety of techniques, and we sometimes will impart movement. Sometimes we dead drift them under like a large dry fly, say a caddis pupil, a couple feet underneath a big hopper. We call that a hopper dropper setup, and that can be very effective. But you can also impart movement. You know, we can slowly lift the rod tip and bring these flies up as if they're rising to the surface. That can be very effective. With soft hackles, we actually want movement, so we'll swing them in the water column or strip them back towards us. That can also be good. Sometimes you'll fish emerging insects that are just under the surface of the water, even a few millimeters, and the trout will really be keying on that. You know, one good tip is if you see trout that look like they're rising, but you're not really seeing their mouths come to the surface, maybe you're seeing their backs, their dorsal fins porpoising through the surface of the water, that means they're usually taking these wet flies just below the surface, and that's a great time to try one of those. Now, the third type of fly I want to talk about are dry flies, and they're called dry because they sit on the surface of the water. This can really be the most fun that you ever have with a fly rod, because you see the fish actually rise and take the flies. Sometimes just a delicate sip, sometimes a really aggressive splashy rise, but it's always exciting. Now, dry flies actually run a really big gamut of sizes, from very tiny size 20 or 22 midge patterns all the way up to big chunky hoppers and stoneflies. Regardless, you want to have generally longer leaders, more supple. You generally don't want any movement on the fly. You want to dead drift them. That means really nice presentations, properly mending, very accurate casts. But with some of the bigger flies like hoppers and stoneflies, often we'll strip these or twitch them, and that can really induce a very exciting strike. Now, one last little tip about dry fly fishing: it's very important that those flies stay up on the surface of the water. So you need to use some extra gear when you're dry fly fishing. This is a floatant. We just rub it into our flies before we start fishing them, and it just repels water, keeps them floating high. If they do start to get a bit waterlogged, then you can use a desiccant powder like this just to dry them off, absorb the moisture, and then keep fishing them again. Or just switch to a new fly that's ready to go. All right, the last group of flies we're going to talk about is the streamer fly. Now, this isn't necessarily an aquatic insect. Generally with streamers, we're trying to mimic things like leeches or baitfish patterns, big meals for hungry fish. This could be a lot of fun because you're generally fishing these with a tight line, no slack, and so when that trout hits the fly, you feel it. Now, sometimes streamers will be pretty small like this, just mimicking little fry or small baitfish and leeches. Sometimes they can get really big to mimic large baitfish for bull trout here in Alberta, or pike especially. That can be really fun as well. Now, when we streamer fish in the rivers, we almost always want to use some sort of sink tip line, either a sink tip that you buy or a fly line with an integrated sink tip, because you want those flies to get down to the right depth and then stay down there. If you're fishing from shore, general rule is we're going to cast these out nice and far, pretty much to the middle of the river, do a big mend, and then let the current take it and swing that fly back towards shore. You'll often get a lot of strikes on the swing. When we're fishing from a drift boat with streamers, we'll actually do the opposite. We'll cast to the bank, right behind deflections, and start to strip that aggressively back towards the boat. Either way, streamer fishing is an active way to fish, and it's a lot of fun. Okay, so we've covered those four main groups of flies. Now what I want to do is talk about flies that you as a beginner are going to want to have for the Bow River specifically. Some cases I'll be talking about particular flies, but there's so many on the market. I'm really going to stick mostly to kinds of insects, and then you can find flies that will match those insects well. So the first thing we're talking about is nymphs, and here in the Bow River, the first thing is worms. Worm patterns work all the time. It's a good idea to have a whole variety. I actually prefer tiny red worms. That's my choice, but a lot of people like to fish the bigger stuff. You want to have some sort of mayfly representation. So pheasant tails are a great classic pattern. Perdigons, things with hot spots I find really effective. So tied with an orange or red collar can be really good. Prince nymphs are actually a great classic fly to have on the bow as well. In larger sizes, they can mimic stoneflies and squallas, and in smaller sizes, lots of mayflies, even boatmen. It's a really nice pattern to have. Now, stoneflies are a great option to have here in the Bow River as well. They live in the rivers year-round, so they can be a really good option any time of year. I like on the bow a smaller black or dark stonefly pattern. Girdle bugs or little black Kaufman stones can be great. Otherwise, though, don't be afraid to go to quite large golden stone patterns. This is a classic hatch that we have on the bow. You definitely want to have those as well. Now, when it comes to wet flies, there aren't as many that I would normally keep in my box, but there's a choice few that I think are really important. Caddis pupa patterns are a really nice choice. You can dead drift these underneath a dropper, only a couple feet below the surface. That can be really effective. Or you can actually get these down deep and then lift them with the rod as if the caddis is trying to escape to the surface. That can also be really good when trout are keying in on that. Now, this is a very traditional soft hackle fly. You can actually fish these by themselves. I generally don't, though, but I really like these behind streamers. Swinging these across the river, sometimes the trout won't take the large baitfish pattern, but they see this little guy swinging just 16 inches behind that streamer, and they'll often hit this. The third fly here is the water boatman. I think everybody should have these in a Bow River fly box. We get prolific hatches of these late fall through the winter and then into spring, and these are very versatile flies. You can use these in a nymph rig below an indicator way down deep. You can lift these, you can twitch these, you can bring these behind a streamer. This is a kind of fly that you can fish in many different ways, and it's absolutely essential when the boatmen are out. Okay, so what dry flies do you need for a Bow River fly box? Well, first we're going to start with tiny midges. Think size 18, 20, 22. This is an adult midge pattern, Griffiths gnats. These are all good choices. Very small, but throughout the wintertime, this is by far our most prolific dry fly hatch. Now, we do get a lot of mayflies on the Bow River, all sorts. I mean, blue-wing olives, pale morning duns, there's a whole bunch. And so really, I don't find that you have to have every single variety. Here I've got a purple haze, which works really well. Classic parachute Adams. You can certainly get those in blue-wing olive or pale morning dun colors if you want. But just a good classic parachute mayfly, dry fly pattern can be very good. Now, we also get a lot of caddis hatches. Sometimes Mother's Day caddis, we'll get October caddis, which will be quite large, but all throughout the summer in the evenings, big caddis patches. And so if you've got like a classic elk hair pattern, that's a great choice to have. Get these in larger sizes for the October caddis. Otherwise, small size 16s and 18s can be really good there. We do have a good hopper season, sort of late summer into fall, so all sorts of hopper patterns can be really effective. I particularly like tan or peach, but certainly purple, green, they work as well. And when we get lucky, when our runoff coincides sort of middle of June to late June, and we don't get raging chocolate milk-colored waters, then we can get really good stonefly hatches. They don't last very long, but big, large stoneflies on the water, you can dead drift them or skate them across the water or strip them. And when it's keying in, that can be some really exciting action, especially late at night or early morning. And now finally, streamer flies for the Bow River. You're basically be targeting three kinds of food. You're going to have fry and bait fish. So think of Crelex minnows like this, or Clouser minnows, sparkle minnows. I like shinier stuff on bright days, and then all sorts of colors will work. Olive, white, black, all very effective. Another kind of bait fish that's very popular is sculpins. We get a lot of these in the Bow River. They represent a big meal. So whether you go to really large flies like this or smaller flies like this, if they've got that sort of olive color that really get low to the ground, look like a natural pattern, that can be a great sculpin pattern. And here's sort of our go-to, if I only had to choose one streamer fly the rest of my life, it's a peacock leech. Leech patterns are very effective in the Bow River, but the peacock leech in particular is very good. That classic pattern, ginger hackle, peacock curl body, black tail with a bead. You can dead drift these in a nymph rig, you can swing them like a streamer, you can fish them many different ways, and they just work. All right, thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you guys found that useful and educational. Again, there's so many flies that you could buy at the shop or tie, and that really is half the fun. But if you try to stick to these main categories and broad groups of insects that we're trying to mimic on the Bow River, you'll have really good success. Though absolutely leave in the comments below any questions you have, flies that you think would work really well, or flies that you want us to make suggestions about in particular. We'd be happy to do that. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and until next time, we'll see you soon.